Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. In the shimmering metropolis of New Eden, where skyscrapers pierced the clouds and sunlight reflected off gleaming surfaces, a society lived divided not by wealth, but by genes. High above the city, where the air was clean and the view endless, the genetically enhanced elite moved through their daily lives with ease, their sharpened minds and augmented bodies engineered for success. Down below, in the crowded lower sectors, the ordinary humans struggled, bound to their unmodified flesh, grinding through workdays in the shadow of the elite. Elliot Reeves stood on a balcony overlooking the city, the distant hum of activity barely audible. His fingers gripped the edge of the railing as he scanned the skyline, his jaw clenched. It was election night, and his heart pounded with the weight of what was coming. "How long until the results?" he asked, without turning. His voice carried a tension that his campaign manager, Carla, had grown accustomed to. 15 minutes, Carla replied. "You're trending well, Elliot. Don't lose hope." Hope. That word had carried him through months of grueling speeches, rallies, and interviews. He'd been the voice for the people down below, the ordinary humans, the ones who couldn't afford the genetic modifications that turned the elite into near gods. He had promised them equality. He had promised them a chance to rise. And now, it all came down to this. He turned to face Carla, her sharp eyes scanning the data on her handheld. The campaign headquarters buzzed behind her, filled with staff, supporters, and volunteers clinging to the hope that Elliot would be the one to change everything. "Do you think we did enough?" Elliot asked quietly. Carla looked up from her screen, her expression softening. "You did more than enough, Elliot. You gave them a vision. Win or lose, you've already changed the conversation." But Elliot knew it wasn't enough to just change the conversation. He needed to win. Without victory, the elite would tighten their grip on society, and the gap between the genetically enhanced and the ordinary would grow into an unbridgeable chasm. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. And then, the screen flickered. "Here we go," Carla said, her voice tight. The results began streaming in. Elliot watched, his heart in his throat, as the numbers rolled across the screen. His opponent, Dr. Lucius Gray, the man who represented everything Elliot fought against, was leading. The room fell silent. Murmurs spread as the numbers solidified, and the final results blinked across the screen. Gray had won, by a wide margin. Elliot's breath left him in a rush, and the world seemed to tilt for a moment. The faces around him blurred, their expressions a mix of disbelief and defeat. He felt a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "You fought hard, Elliot," Carla said softly. He nodded, the words hollow in his ears. But it wasn't enough. For a few minutes, the room seemed suspended in shock. The air was thick with disappointment, but Elliot knew he couldn't let it settle in. Not for long. He stepped up to the podium, clearing his throat as the room quieted. Hundreds of eyes turned to him, hopeful despite the defeat. They needed him to say something, to make sense of what had happened. "My friends," Elliot began, his voice steady but strained, "tonight wasn't the victory we hoped for. But this fight, it's far from over." There was a stir in the crowd, a flicker of energy. They were listening. They needed him now more than ever. "We always knew that change wouldn't come easy," he continued. "We always knew that those in power would fight to keep it. But what we've built together, this movement, this vision of a world where genetic equality is a right, not a privilege that will never die." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, but growing. "Gray may have won this election," Elliot said, "but he has not won the future. We will keep pushing, we will keep fighting, and one day, we will make sure that every person, no matter their genetic code, has the same chance at life, liberty, and opportunity." The applause swelled. For the first time that night, Elliot felt a spark of hope light within him again. The battle was far from over, and his path was just beginning. 3 days later, the world had moved on. Dr. Lucius Gray stood at the pinnacle of power, delivering speeches about natural evolution and the bright future of genetically enhanced leadership. The media had already shifted its focus, painting Gray as the inevitable victor, the natural leader for this genetically superior age. But in the quieter parts of New Eden, something else was brewing. Elliot sat across from Dr. Naomi Zinn in a dingy, underground cafe tilde copyright in one of the lower sectors. The contrast between the gleaming, sterile world above and the rough, cluttered space they now occupied was stark. But it felt right. It felt like home. Naomi, a geneticist and one of Elliot's oldest allies, was speaking quickly, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "We have it, Elliot. We've cracked it." Elliot leaned forward. "Cracked what?" "The solution, the answer to everything we've been fighting for." She pulled a small device from her bag, placing it on the table. It was no larger than a handheld, its surface smooth and unremarkable. But Elliot knew better. Naomi Zinn didn't get excited about gadgets unless they had the potential to change the world. "This," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "is the key to genetic freedom." Elliot's heart skipped. "How?" Naomi glanced around, lowering her voice further. "We've been working on it for years, an open source gene editing platform. It bypasses the proprietary tech that the elite use for their modifications. It's cheap, accessible, and best of all, it works." Elliot's mind raced. "You're telling me you've developed a way to bring genetic modification to everyone, not just the elite?" Naomi nodded. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." A surge of hope flooded Elliot's chest. This was it. This was the weapon they needed. If they could get this technology into the hands of the public, the elite's stranglehold on society would crumble. But even as the excitement grew, so did the fear. "If Gray and his people find out about this," Elliot began. "They can't stop it," Naomi said firmly. "Once we release it into the public domain, it'll be everywhere." Unstoppable. Elliot sat back, his mind spinning. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about winning an election anymore. It was about changing the very fabric of society. "What do we need to do?" he asked, his voice steady. Naomi smiled. "We need to distribute it quietly, at first. Build support. When the time is right, we'll release it to the world." Elliot's resolve hardened. This was their chance. It was dangerous, it was risky, but it was the only way to truly bring equality to a world that had lost its way. Over the next few weeks, Elliot and Naomi worked in secret, gathering allies, spreading the word through underground channels. The tech, they called it Gen Freedom, began to circulate among trusted individuals, each one sworn to secrecy. But they weren't the only ones moving in the shadows. Unbeknownst to Elliot, Lucius Gray had caught wind of something. His surveillance networks, ever watchful, had detected ripples small at first, but growing. Gray's paranoia grew with each passing day, until finally, he acted. Elliot paced a dimly lit room in the underground bunker, his mind racing with the latest updates from Naomi. The Gen Freedom tech was spreading faster than they had anticipated. What started as a cautious dissemination through trusted channels had turned into a full-blown movement. People were modifying their genes in secret, quietly transforming themselves in the shadows of New Eden, far from the prying eyes of the elite. Naomi sat at a makeshift desk, scanning through encrypted messages on her handheld. Words spreading quickly, she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and concern. "We've got reports from 3 more sectors. People are taking the tech and running with it." Elliot nodded, his brow furrowed. "It's what we wanted, but it's also dangerous. If Gray's people catch wind of Thesa." "They already have," Naomi interrupted, her fingers pausing on the screen. She looked up, her expression grave. "I intercepted a communication. Gray's surveillance network is sniffing around. They don't know exactly what we're up to yet, but it's only a matter of time." Elliot stopped pacing, his pulse quickening. "We need to move faster. If Gray figures out what's happening, he'll shut it down before we can reach the tipping point." Naomi nodded in agreement. "We're close, but we need to be smart. If we release everything too soon, We risk exposing ourselves. Elliot walked over to the desk, his mind racing with options. What about a decoy? Something to throw them off the scent while we finalize the distribution? Naomi considered the idea for a moment, then nodded slowly. That could work, but we'll need to coordinate with our allies carefully. One misstep and Gray will know something's up. Elliot glanced at the encrypted messages scrolling across the screen. They were running out of time, but he knew they had to be careful. One wrong move, and all their work would be undone. We'll set up a decoy, Elliot said decisively. Start planting false leads, but keep the real distribution channels moving. We can't afford to be caught now. For the next several days, they worked in constant motion. Elliot coordinated with their network of underground operatives, spreading misinformation to confuse Gray's surveillance teams. Meanwhile, Naomi and her team accelerated the distribution of gin freedom, ensuring that it reached the hands of more and more ordinary citizens. The movement grew in size and strength, and with it, the threat of exposure loomed larger. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting the lower levels of New Eden into shadow, Elliot received an urgent message from one of his contacts. Jonah Green, a longtime ally and trusted friend, had disappeared. Elliot's heart sank. Jonah had been with him from the beginning, one of the few who truly believed in the cause of genetic equality. His disappearance was a red flag that something was very wrong. Naomi's voice cut through his thoughts. Elliot, we need to talk. He turned to her, a knot tightening in his chest. What is it? I've been digging into some of the recent communications, Naomi said, her voice low. There's something off. Jonah might not be missing. He might have switched sides. Elliot's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? I found a series of encrypted messages that point to Jonah working with Gray's people. It looks like he's been feeding them information. He might have been the leak this whole time. Elliot felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Jonah? The man he trusted with everything? It didn't seem possible. But the evidence was there, staring him in the face. Betrayal cut deeper than any wound. What do we do? Naomi asked quietly, watching his reaction carefully. Elliot clenched his fists, trying to suppress the anger that boiled inside him. We keep moving. Jonah's betrayal might slow us down, but we can't stop. We're too close. He stepped away from Naomi, taking a deep breath to steady himself. We'll need to lock down the remaining distribution channels. Make sure Jonah hasn't compromised them. Naomi nodded, already pulling up the necessary files. I'll get on it. For the next few hours, they worked in tense silence, securing the distribution network and cutting off any access points that Jonah might have compromised. The betrayal weighed heavily on Elliot, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. The stakes were too high. He had to focus on the bigger picture, on what was coming. The following week was a blur of activity. The gin freedom technology continued to spread, reaching more and more of the lower sectors. People were embracing their newfound abilities, quietly modifying themselves to level the playing field. It was a revolution happening in plain sight, but just under the radar of Gray's administration, until it wasn't. One morning, just as Elliot and Naomi were finalizing the last steps of the distribution, the news broke. A massive crackdown had begun. Gray's forces were raiding suspected hideouts, arresting anyone involved in the genetic modification movement. The elite had finally caught wind of what was happening, and they were determined to crush it. Elliot stood in front of a small screen, watching the footage of people being dragged out of their homes, their hands bound in restraints. It was a nightmare. Everything they had worked for was at risk of being destroyed. We've got to release it now, Naomi said urgently, her face pale. We don't have any more time. Elliot nodded, his throat tight. Do it. Naomi's fingers flew across the keyboard, her expression focused. She tapped into the secure network they had built, bypassing firewalls and security protocols. Within minutes, the Gen Freedom technology was uploaded and released to the public. It was out in the open now, unstoppable. Elliot stood behind her, his heart pounding. This was it. The moment they had been working toward for so long. The elite could no longer control genetic modification. It was in the hands of the people now, and there was no going back. But as the exhilaration of victory washed over him, Elliot knew the battle wasn't over. Far from it. The next few days were chaotic. As people across New Eden and beyond accessed the Gen Freedom technology, the response from the elite was swift and brutal. Gray's government declared martial law in an attempt to contain the uprising. Soldiers patrolled the streets, enforcing curfews and rounding up anyone suspected of being involved with the movement. Elliot and Naomi moved from hideout to hideout, staying one step ahead of the crackdown. They knew they had succeeded in releasing the technology, but the question now was whether they could survive the aftermath. One night, as they sat in a dimly lit safe house, Naomi looked at Elliot, her face wary. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Elliot stared at her for a moment, the weight of her question pressing down on him. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "But I know we had to try." Naomi nodded, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "We've changed everything, but I'm not sure if it's for the better." Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. The world had shifted, but whether it was toward equality or chaos, he couldn't yet say. The days passed, and the city erupted into conflict. The elite fought to maintain control, while ordinary citizens, newly empowered by their genetic modifications, pushed back. It was a battle for the future, and Elliot knew that the outcome would shape the world for generations to come. As he stood on a rooftop one evening, looking out over the city, Elliot thought about everything they had sacrificed. Jonah's betrayal, the lives lost in the crackdown, the chaos now consuming New Eden. It was a high price to pay for freedom, but it was the only way forward. In the distance, he could see the lights of the elite sectors, still gleaming above the chaos. But down below, in the streets, a different light was starting to flicker. A spark of hope, a spark of change. Elliot turned away from the cityscape, his resolve hardening. The fight wasn't over. It might never be over. But for the first time, he believed that the future, whatever it held, belonged to everyone.